In the 2nd or 3rd century BC, somewhere in the Han Dynasty heartland of China, soldiers in an imperial training yard were doing something that had absolutely nothing to do with entertainment. They were preparing for war. Military instructors had their men kicking a leather ball stuffed with feathers and hair back and forth across a marked patch of ground, not for fun, but to sharpen footwork, balance, and reflexes that would later matter on an actual battlefield. The game was called Kuju, literally kickball, and it wasn't played for trophies or crowds. It was played because a soldier who could control a moving object with his feet under pressure was a soldier who could also dodge a spear thrust or hold his footing in a melee. Nobody in that training yard was trying to invent the world's most popular sport. They were trying to keep infantry alive. And yet that one military drill, a ball kicked back and forth between bored, sweating soldiers somewhere in ancient China, eventually became the single most consequential recreational invention in the history of human civilization. The seed from which the World Cup, the Premier League, and every five-a-side match on every patch of concrete on Earth would eventually grow. So how did humans get from a battlefield drill in Han Dynasty China to 11 players, 90 minutes, and 1 billion people watching on television? The answer takes us through a Roman legionary's training routine, a mob brawl through the streets of medieval English towns, several royal bands that nobody actually obeyed, a handful of British schoolboys arguing about rules in a smoky London pub, and a slow, steady migration of one simple idea, kicking a ball toward a goal, across an entire planet, until it reshaped the cultural calendar of nearly every country on Earth. Let's start with what that early version of the game actually looked like, because understanding the basic shape of it helps explain why everything that followed happened the way it did. Kuju, as it developed under the Han Dynasty and later flourished during the Tang and Song dynasties, involved kicking a round leather ball through an opening in a net strung between two poles, all without using the hands. By the Tang Dynasty, the rules had become considerably more sophisticated, with recorded matches, organized teams, and even professional players who performed for the imperial court. Historical accounts describe emperors watching Kuju matches as spectator entertainment, and some sources even mention women's teams competing in the sport, which tells you the game had already drifted a long way from its original purpose as a piece of military conditioning. In its earliest documented form, kicking a ball with intent and structure wasn't unique to China either. Roughly around the same period and continuing for centuries afterward, the ancient Greeks played a game called episkiros, a rough, physical contest involving a ball and two teams trying to force it past each other's boundary lines using whatever combination of hands and feet seemed useful in the moment. The Romans, never a culture to leave a good idea unmodified, adapted this into a game called pastime, a small, hard ball wrestled and kicked between two teams on a marked field, often used specifically as a conditioning exercise for soldiers in the Roman legions. Exactly the kind of disciplined, vaguely violent physical training you'd expect from a civilization that built its entire identity around military readiness. For generations, ordinary people across the ancient Mediterranean and East Asian worlds encountered ball games of this kind primarily as exercise and ritual rather than entertainment, kicking and shoving a stuffed leather sphere around dusty fields that had nothing to do with the orderly, rule-bound spectacle football would eventually become. That changed, gradually and then suddenly, once medieval Europe got its hands on the same basic idea and stripped away almost all of the discipline. Between the 9th and 14th centuries, English and French villages developed something now generally referred to as mob football. And the design was genuinely about as chaotic as a game could possibly be. Take two entire village populations, sometimes hundreds of people on each side, give them an inflated pig's bladder, and tell them to get it to the opposing parish's church or marketplace by absolutely any means necessary. The result was less a sporting contest and more a rolling, day-long brawl that surged through streets, fields, rivers, and the occasional shopfront. turning an ordinary Shrove Tuesday into something considerably more terrifying for anyone who happened to live along the route. Towns like Ashbourne in Derbyshire and Atherstone in Warwickshire hosted versions of this game that survive in modified form even today. And by every contemporary account, the matches were brutal, with broken bones, trampled bystanders, and property damage treated as an unremarkable cost of the festivities. The chaos was the point as much as the result. Villagers who spent their entire year working fields and trades suddenly found themselves locked in a single shared, sanctioned outlet for aggression. And that kind of communal release often mattered as much to medieval town life as whichever side actually got the bladder to the church door. Once mob football had proven itself a genuine menace to public order, the response from people in charge followed a fairly predictable pattern. King Edward II banned the game in London in 1314, worried that the noise and disruption surrounding it were drawing crowds away from archery practice that the crown actually needed for national defense, since longbowmen, not unruly ball games, were what won medieval wars. Edward III, Richard II, and Henry IV all issued their own bans in the following decades, each one essentially repeating the same complaint that football was distracting able-bodied men from the military training the kingdom genuinely depended on. This was a genuinely significant historical irony, because the very thing modern football fans now treat as a beloved national pastime was, for roughly 3 centuries, treated by the English crown as something closer to a public safety hazard and a threat to the kingdom's defense readiness. The bans were, by nearly every account, almost completely ignored. Village football kept being played in back alleys and open fields regardless of what the king's proclamation said, which tells you something honest about how much ordinary people actually cared about royal decrees when there was a ball to chase. The next major shift in the game's development came not from royal command, but from somewhere considerably more mundane: the English public school system. By the early 19th century, elite boarding schools across England, places like Eton, Harrow, Rugby, and Winchester, had each developed their own local, informal version of football, played according to whatever rules the senior boys at that particular school happened to prefer. This was a genuinely significant conceptual leap because it shifted the game from an unstructured, occasionally lethal village brawl toward something with at least the beginnings of consistent rules, fixed numbers of players, and a defined playing area. The trouble was that none of these schools agreed with each other. Rugby school allowed players to pick up the ball and run with it, a variation supposedly originating from a moment in 1823 when a student named William Webb Ellis, according to a long-standing but historically shaky legend, simply grabbed the ball mid-match and ran toward the opposing goal. Eton and several other schools, by contrast, insisted that the ball never touch a player's hands at all. When students from these different schools went off to university, particularly to Cambridge, they discovered that nobody could actually agree on what game they were supposed to be playing, since the rules they'd each grown up with were essentially mutually exclusive. By the 1840s, this disagreement had become enough of a practical problem that students at Cambridge University attempted something genuinely ambitious: sitting down together and trying to negotiate a single, unified set of rules everyone could play by, regardless of which school they'd come from. The first formal attempt, known as the Cambridge Rules, emerged in 1848. And while the document itself hasn't survived in its original form, it represented the earliest serious effort to standardize what had until then been a patchwork of incompatible local traditions. Once that standardization had proven possible at a university level, the pace of organization accelerated quickly, and each successive step followed a fairly logical, almost obvious next move from whatever had come immediately before it. The decisive moment arrived on the 26th of October, 1863, in a London pub called the Freemasons' Tavern, where representatives from 11 London area football clubs gathered for what would become a series of meetings to settle, once and for all, whether handling the ball and hacking an opponent's shins were legitimate parts of the game or not. This was the founding of the Football Association, and the debates that unfolded over those meetings were genuinely heated. Clubs that favored the rugby-style game, where carrying the ball and tripping or kicking an opponent's legs were accepted tactics, found themselves increasingly outvoted by clubs who wanted a cleaner, foot-only version of the sport. When the Football Association finally settled on rules that banned both handling the ball and hacking, the representative from Blackheath Football Club walked out in protest and refused to join, taking his rugby-style preferences with him. That walkout turned out to be one of sport's more consequential breakups, because it formally split what had been one tangled tradition into two separate sports heading in two entirely different directions. Association football on one side, which would eventually be shortened in slang to a sock and then further to soccer, and rugby football on the other, which kept the handling and tackling that the new Football Association had just rejected. Both games trace back to that same patchwork of incompatible public school traditions, both rooted in the same disorganized village football that English kings had spent 3 centuries trying and failing to ban. From there, the newly codified game of association football spread outward along multiple overlapping routes simultaneously, carried not by conquering armies the way gunpowder had once traveled, but by something almost as effective: British industry, trade, and empire. Engineers, sailors, merchants, and school teachers working abroad for British companies brought the game with them wherever they went, teaching it to local workers and students as a kind of informal cultural export that nobody back in London had specifically planned or organized. British railway workers helped popularize the sport in Argentina and Brazil. Sailors and dock workers spread it through port cities across South America and continental Europe. Mining engineers and businessmen carried it into Spain and Italy. Some historians studying this period point to a broader pattern worth appreciating: that football wasn't the only major British export crossing the world during this era. Industrial machinery, railway technology, and the English language itself all traveled the same general routes during roughly the same stretch of decades, part of a much larger flow of culture and commerce moving outward from a single small island, long before anyone had coined the term globalization to describe it. The transformation wasn't instant in any of these places. Early local clubs forming in Buenos Aires, Milan, and Barcelona during the late 19th century were often founded directly by British expatriates or local students who had studied in England and brought the rulebook home in their luggage, sometimes literally. Club Atletico River Plate, AC Milan, and FC Barcelona all carry traces of this British origin in their founding stories, even though football in each of these countries would go on to develop its own distinct national style, almost entirely independent of its English roots, within a generation or two. But even in this early, imported form, the game carried a practical and social impact that older local pastimes simply couldn't match. It required no expensive equipment beyond a ball. It could be played on virtually any open patch of ground, and it scaled effortlessly from a handful of children kicking a rag-stuffed sack in an alley to organized matches between full club teams in front of paying crowds. The entire social structure around the sport: who got to play it, who got to watch it, and who got to profit from it, began shifting rapidly as football moved from elite English schoolyards into working-class neighborhoods across Europe and South America within just a few decades. This shift had consequences far beyond the matches themselves, reshaping the very architecture of how nations organized public leisure. As local leagues grew steadily more popular and increasingly central to civic identity, cities began building dedicated stadiums specifically designed to house the kind of large, paying crowds that football reliably attracted, structures that looked almost nothing like the open village fields and schoolyard pitches where the game had first taken root. Football associations sprang up nation by nation through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, each one borrowing the basic framework the English Football Association had hammered out at the Freemasons' Tavern decades earlier, then adapting it to local circumstances and rivalries. The disorganized mob brawl that English kings had once tried to ban in the name of national defense had, within the span of roughly 6 centuries, become the organizing principle behind entire national sporting calendars. The next genuinely important leap came in 1904 with the founding of FIFA, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, in Paris, an organization created specifically to oversee international competition between countries whose football associations had developed somewhat independently of each other since that original split at the Freemasons' Tavern. And this single development is what finally turned a patchwork of national leagues into a genuinely global, unified sport with shared international rules. The fundamental problem facing international football in the early 20th century was that different countries had, in some cases, drifted toward slightly different interpretations of the rules. And there was no single body with the authority to settle disputes or organize matches between national teams on neutral, agreed terms. FIFA solved this by establishing a central governing authority that could standardize the laws of the game across every member nation, freeing players and fans for the first time in history to watch a match between, say, England and France, and know with confidence that both sides were playing by precisely the same rulebook. This may sound like a modest organizational tweak, but it was genuinely transformative because it set the stage for the creation of the World Cup in 1930, hosted in Uruguay, the first tournament ever organized specifically to determine a true global champion rather than simply a regional or domestic one. By the time that first tournament kicked off in Montevideo, the game that had begun as Han Dynasty military drills and Roman conditioning exercises survived 3 centuries of royal bans in medieval England, splintered out of a heated rules dispute in a London pub, and traveled the world in the luggage of railway engineers and sailors, had become something its earliest practitioners would never have recognized. A structured, internationally governed spectacle capable of uniting entire countries around a single 90-minute contest. Outside the Football Association's original sphere of influence, the story didn't stop with FIFA's founding either. Local variations and traditions kept emerging and overlapping with the main international game, even as the sport globalized. Brazil developed its own distinctive improvisational style shaped heavily by street football played on uneven, cramped urban surfaces where close control mattered more than long, structured passing. Argentina cultivated its own tactical traditions rooted in those same British imported clubs, but reshaped by decades of local competition and rivalry. These regional variations never fully disappeared the way mob football eventually did once the codified game matured. Instead, they persisted as distinct stylistic branches of the same underlying sport. Branches that would resurface decades later in the form of national playing identities still debated by commentators and fans today. The story of football, in other words, doesn't lead to just one single way of playing the game. It branches constantly, with different cultures shaping the same basic framework of kicking a ball toward a goal into wildly different expressions of the same original idea, all rooted in the same accidental, scattered origins among soldiers, schoolboys, and villagers who never imagined any of it. Looking back across this entire arc, from a Han Dynasty training yard in ancient China to a packed stadium in Montevideo hosting the first World Cup nearly 2,000 years later, the story of how humans invented football is really a story about repetition, regulation, and migration happening together over an enormous span of time. Nobody set out on day one to invent the world's most popular sport. Chinese soldiers kicking a feather-stuffed ball were trying to sharpen their footwork for war. Roman legionaries wrestling over a hard leather sphere were trying to stay fit for the next campaign. English villagers chasing an inflated pig's bladder through the streets were releasing a year's worth of pent-up energy on a single chaotic afternoon, not designing a global pastime. Each individual stage, the shift from military drill to festival brawl, from royal band to public school tradition, from incompatible local rulebooks to a single unified football association. From one small island's pastime to a genuinely global sport governed by a single international body, addressed a specific practical problem that players, schools, or organizers had actually encountered with the version that came before it. None of it required some singular genius moment of total invention. It required centuries of incremental refinement carried across continents by trade routes, schoolyard arguments, and the kind of slow cultural exchange that quietly reshapes the world while nobody's watching closely enough to notice it happening in real time. passing through Han Dynasty soldiers, Roman legionaries, medieval English villagers, Victorian schoolboys, London club representatives, and railway engineers scattered across South America, each group reshaping the game just slightly before handing it on to the next. The sport that would eventually fill stadiums on every continent, unite entire nations around a single afternoon every 4 years, and become the single most watched form of human competition on Earth, began its existence as a battlefield drill, a discarded royal ban, and a pub argument nobody expected to matter.